and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Adjun Legal on data privacy and cybersecurity risk management, legal strategies for protecting digital assets and customer trust. I am Elojo Joy and I am a legal intern at Adun Legal. At Adun Legal, we protect your business, technology, intellectual property, and your future. Now, what this means is that we work closely with startups and founders like you to navigate regulatory uncertainty, especially in fast evolving and highly regulated sectors. We are delighted to have you join us for what promises to be a timely and insightful conversation on one of the most critical issues shaping modern business operations today. As organizations continue to embrace digital transformation, artificial intelligence, cloud technologies, and data driven systems, the importance of strong privacy governance and cybersecurity resilience has never been more significant. Across industries, businesses are navigating increasing regulatory obligations, rising cyber threats, evolving customer expectations, and growing concerns around digital trust. Now, the ability to protect sensitive information, manage cybersecurity risk effectively, and maintain compliance is indeed no longer just a technical issue. It has become a core business and governance priority. Today's session is designed to provide practical legal and strategic insights into how organizations can proactively manage these challenges, strengthen operational resilience, and build sustainable trust in an increasingly interconnected digital environment. So, whether you're a founder, operator, startup, in house counsel, compliance professional, or you're simply trying to understand what data privacy and cybersecurity risk management entails, you're in the right room. We are especially pleased to have with us a speaker whose experience and expertise in data protection, regulatory compliance, and AI governance make her well positioned to guide this important discussion. It is now my most esteemed pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, the stellar barrister Loretta Onwegbuize. Now, I know we might be conversant with her profile, which is already on her LinkedIn page, but I'll go ahead to read her profile. Loretta is a lawyer versed in contracts, regulatory compliance, data protection, and AI governance. She's a data protection analyst at Tech Hive Advisory, supporting clients within Africa and the Middle East on privacy, cybersecurity, regulatory intelligence, and AI governance projects. Experienced in contract administration and policy advisory, Loretta has conducted data protection audits, supported information security management systems slash privacy information management systems audits, and contributed to the operationalization of privacy programs. Now, without taking any further time, I will be handing over to our speaker today, Barrister Loretta. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Joy, for that lovely introduction. Um, I want to first express my appreciation to Adun Legal for having me on today's webinar series, for inviting me to, share my thoughts and insights on this very important conversation that we're about to have around data privacy and cybersecurity risk management. Every business now, in some way, has started to either integrate technology into their operations, that's for traditional businesses, or some businesses are now even so tech focused, and technology is like the basis of the solution and the innovation that they seek to provide. So it's a very important conversation to have. Before now, it was usually overlooked, but I'm honestly very happy to see that um, more and more businesses are beginning to understand how important it is to have the right procedures and processes in place to manage privacy and cybersecurity risks. So thank you um, for having me speak on this topic. I would begin the presentation without any further ado. I've already been well introduced by Joyce, so I think we can just get right into it. Our agenda for today would be very simple, very straight to the point. The conversation is a very deep one, but I doubt that we can even use 3 hours to exhaust everything that needs to be said. But I've tried to make today's presentation as simple and easy to understand as possible so that founders, compliance professionals, whoever would watch this later would then, take some of these insights and do more extensive research on it as it applies to their organization. So I've already began the introduction and I'll just wrap up the introduction, after which we'll look at some digital assets and just try to understand what digital assets are in the context of the conversation. Then we'll also look at some common privacy and security risks that many organizations face with the level of technology that we have today. We would also look at certain regulatory compliance requirements that just go to show that even the law has started to catch up, and we have laws that now regulate and place obligations on organizations to ensure data privacy and cybersecurity. Then we'll now go into the meat of the discussion, which is around legal risk management strategies. And then we'll look at some technical management strategies. Then we'll look at breach management timelines, because a lot of organizations, the goal with all these processes and procedures is for there to not be privacy breaches or security incidents. However, in the event that it does happen, to retain customer trust and maintain brand reputation, is also important to have a procedure and process in place to quickly respond when incidents eventually occur. And then we'll just look at the core lessons from the presentation. And if there's anyone watching live who has a question, we'll do some Q&A. All right, so I've already began the introduction, and I mentioned earlier that we have some traditional businesses who before now, maybe they were not very tech savvy, technology was not a big part of their operations, but now has started to integrate technology into their operations. For example, schools, many schools may not have the level of technological sophistication, but now a lot more schools are beginning to adopt technology. Even for businesses, some businesses were very traditional, with store owners just using calculators to calculate things and having like a cabinet where they store files. But now, more businesses are adopting cloud infrastructure, storing their personal data of their customers on say Google Drive, for instance, or OneDrive, depending on what cloud infrastructure software they decide to use. And then we have another category of companies and businesses that they are tech focused and their solutions are tech driven. But one thing both categories of businesses have in common is personal data. So whether they're a traditional business or a tech focused business, companies collect personal data of their employees, personal data of contractors, personal data of vendors, even for companies that have websites. Some personal data is collected from website visitors. And personal data could be full names, people's email addresses, people's phone numbers, people's physical addresses and locations, and so on. So the implication here is that every company, every organization now must have adequate measures, legal and technical, to protect the personal data that they are collecting and processing and storing, and to also secure it within their systems. So this will ensure business continuity. It will ensure that brand reputation is maintained, and it will help the business to avoid regulatory sanctions, because as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a nice to have. Data privacy and cybersecurity are not just nice to haves anymore. They are not even buzzwords anymore. They are now part of compliance obligations that are placed on organizations, startups, businesses. And just to sort of distinguish between both concepts, data privacy speaks more to how are we collecting personal data, how are we processing it, what are we using it for, how are we keeping it, how are we securely disposing of it when it has reached the retention period? So you ask questions like, should we use this data? Did we get consent of the data subject to use it in this manner or for this purpose? How are we transparent about how we're actually using the data? Then when we look at the concept of cybersecurity, even from how the word is coined, how do we secure our internal systems? If we even have external servers, how do we ensure that it remains secured? What are the technical measures that we put in place to check and control that data within our systems are kept secure? And it also cybersecurity also extends to how do we maintain the integrity of the data such that no one comes to tamper it and then change the information? How do we maintain the confidentiality of the data? Imagine a health tech company with people's health information, and maybe even information about sexual orientation, for example. That kind of information is very confidential. And if you run a health tech company, because that even classifies as sensitive personal data, you need to ensure that you have very strong security systems in place so that it doesn't people's personal information doesn't go out in the public. How do we stop people from stealing data? How do we put checks in place such that data is not disclosed without proper authorization? Those are the things that come to mind when we think about cybersecurity. One thing Joy had mentioned in her introduction was that these issues that come up around data privacy and cybersecurity are not just issues for the legal department or issues for IT or issues for compliance. They are actual business issues. Um, it's very easy to sort of overlook, and you find that many startup founders are more interested in the numbers. How many people are we reaching? How many customers do we now have? How can we scale? We're currently operating in Nigeria. How do we move to Kenya, South Africa, Ghana? How do we expand? These are very good things, but also thinking about how are we protecting our customers' data? We're using this data in a certain way. Are we transparent about it in our privacy policy? These are not things that readily come to the minds of many founders. They're thinking more, what's the revenue? How much money are we making? But these are actually business issues that should be considered, and not just at the level of, oh, the compliance team, or, oh, this is IT's headache. Even at board level, at management level, it's important to have these discussions and to ensure that things are in place, processes are in place, management is aware, management gives full support for that, because it affects reputation. Reputation takes years to build. One incident or one regulatory investigation can just plummet all the work you have done in building your brand down the drain. Again, because it's a compliance requirement. So you don't want to get into trouble with the regulators, meaning whatever the law has said you should do or put in place as regards privacy and cybersecurity, you must ensure that you do have it in place. If not, it's a risk for the business, because if the regulator decides to investigate, it would usually end up with sanctions, fines, and for some violations, it even goes as far as imprisonment. Also because these issues affect revenue. So, yes, you're thinking about, oh, what marketing strategy are we going to adopt now? How are we going to reach 1 million people? But just one incident, one security or privacy incident, can make you lose that same 1 million people within a very short period of time. And that is loss of revenue for the business. So it's very important. Some of the statistics also show that in Nigeria alone, we lose $600 million plus to cyber crimes, fraudulent crimes, whether through phishing attacks or credit card fraud, different kinds of fraudulent activities. And 66% of Nigerian firms are prone to getting hit by ransomware every 12 months. We may not hear so much about it because, again, some companies might be trying to protect brand reputation, so they will not come out and announce it in the open, but these things actually happen. So now that we have sort of established why the conversation is important and why you as a founder should actually be interested in it and not just in revenue and numbers, um, we will now go on and look at some of the digital assets that actually matter in the context of this conversation. So, a digital asset is anything that exists in a digital format that is uniquely identifiable and holds some form of value, whether economic value, sentimental value, operational value to an individual or an organization. So, there are some digital assets that are not listed here because they're not very relevant to the conversation, like digital assets like EFTs, tokens, cryptocurrency. These are also digital assets because they hold some kind of economic monetary value. But for the purpose of the conversation, the assets we'll be looking at are assets like personal data. Personal data is actually an asset because a person's full name could hold a lot of sentimental value, could even hold economic value. So someone's name is Aliko Dangote, for example. Imagine you go to a place and you say, "Oh, I am Aliko Dangote." Because the name rings a bell and because the name carries a lot of um, reputational weight, there is value ascribed to a person's name. Your email address, your phone number, your physical address, even employee information, um, personal data like your religious belief, um, sexual orientation, your gender, all of this, all of this classifies as personal data that can uniquely identify you as a person and that holds sentimental and even sometimes economic value to people. Then there's intellectual property, digital assets like proprietary code, unique trade secrets, business strategy documents. These are also digital assets because they exist in a digital form. Also, we have financial information. So your BVN, your account number, um, payroll information, your tax identification number, your pension number, all of these are collected by most organizations when they onboard employees. Bank financial statements, transaction records. In the case of maybe an organization that's a payment processor, you'll be keeping transaction records of the payments that you process. um, they are also digital assets. And then there are also infrastructure assets, so your website URL, the social media handles that you have, digital platforms that you probably built internally, like apps, for example. These are also digital assets because it supports how you provide services and products to your customers as a business. So it's an asset for the company. How then do we ensure that these assets remain secure? How do we protect these assets? What legal strategies should we have in place? We will get to that, but maybe just to remind us of some of the common privacy and security risks that businesses are vulnerable to if they don't have the right privacy and cybersecurity checks and controls in place. And I'll just run through them because we will be familiar with some of these risks already. Business email compromise. This one is quite common where you have someone hack into the business email of, say, the CEO of the company, and they now send an email to an employee asking for certain information. The employee thinks it's the CEO asking and just divulges. So there's business email compromise. There are database leaks where personal data is exposed on the dark web. This usually happens after some kind of hacking. Um, a bad actor gains unauthorized access into your systems, can extract all your customers' information, all your staff, employee information, and just leaks it on the dark web. Then there's also social engineering, insider threats. Insider threats are usually, you find this where there are disgruntled employees who maybe have access to certain assets of the company, digital assets of the company, and because they're unhappy about maybe the circumstances surrounding their employment, or their employment is terminated for whatever reason best known to them, they decide to sort of be the bad actor now within the company, to leak information, or sort of do something that halts operations or disrupts operational efficiency, basically. Then there's phishing. This one is very common. You see a lot of information now saying don't click on any link, any suspicious link, any link you cannot verify. 90% of breaches start with just one click. Yeah. Weak passwords is also like a common privacy and security risk, because if you don't use strong passwords to secure your personal data, or say the data is stored somewhere and there's no strong password, anyone can just guess the password, and then voila, all your employees information is available for download. Yes, weak passwords are a common privacy and security risk. Cloud vulnerability as well, although not very common but also not impossible. It does happen where cloud infrastructure providers sometimes are hacked, and then that affects you that is using them as a third party. And then there's also the supply chain. A lot of times, as organizations, as founders, we even do the right thing. We put checks and controls in place. But because it's not economically efficient as a business to say, oh, you're going to build everything you're going to use for yourself, you would surely use third parties. And sometimes the compromise is not even from the company, but from these third parties that are engaged. So third party vendors are also a very weak link. All right. As I have mentioned, it's now a compliance obligation for you to have data privacy and cybersecurity measures in place as a business, as a startup. So I'm just going to sort of focus on the Nigerian laws, um, maybe because I'm in Nigeria, and I do feel that a lot more Nigerian founders and business owners will watch this. But even if you are a Nigerian based business and you wish to extend your services or expand your services to other African countries, all of these things are still very relevant. Just that you would also need to consider the laws in those countries as well. But for Nigeria, there are certain principles of data protection. And before I even start, just also mention that when it comes to data protection laws, laws across Africa and even globally have very similar provisions. And those are the key ones that I have highlighted here in this slide. Just slight differences here and there from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The principles of data protection are applied pretty much across board globally. Security, data minimization, meaning that you shouldn't collect more data than you actually need. Storage limitation principle, also requiring that you don't keep data for too long. You only keep it for as long as necessary, as long as you need it. Once you don't need it anymore, you should securely dispose that data. Because let me give an example now. Imagine I register on a website, or I register on a platform for some service 13 years ago. Ideally, as I have been inactive, my data should have been deleted and my account should have been removed, because I'm not active on that platform anymore. And so they have no reason to really process my data. But some organizations are not, they don't consider that. They may not consider that they have personal data of people that they no longer need. Even thinking as an employer, if an employee has left your employment 20 years ago, you just need to assess and have justification and really think about whether you still need to be keeping their email address and other personal data that you have of them within your systems. What this does is it helps to reduce the risk in the event of unauthorized disclosure or unauthorized access to these systems. So only a very few only few people might be affected if that kind of incident occurs. Not so many people, and people who may not even have any relationship with the organization anymore. Organizations must also implement technical and security measures to secure personal data. It's an obligation. Also, you have to apply the right legal basis for processing data. So if you must get consent of people before you process their personal data in a certain way, you have to get consent. If not, it then means that your processing is unlawful, and it then means that you're at risk of problems with the regulator if they find out. If maybe a data subject, and that's an individual, I'm a data subject, anyone who has I won't say anyone who has personal data, but everyone with personal data, everyone that has a name, an email address, a phone number is a data subject. So imagine you start sending marketing comms to someone who never subscribed or gave you consent to use their email for that purpose. You run at risk with the regulator should they go and report. Also, as a startup, it's very important to appoint or designate a data protection officer. That's the person who will steer the operational aspects of data privacy, cybersecurity implementation, layers with IT. This is what needs to be done. That person basically just steers the pot and brings everyone that needs to be in the room together to say, this is what we need to do to be compliant with the law. Then there are also breach reporting obligations. This differs from country to country. In Nigeria, it's 72 hours once a data breach has been confirmed. And once it comes to the notice of the organization, you must inform the NDPC. And then privacy by design. This simply means that as a startup, you do not wait until you have launched the product before you now start to think about, oh, is this product going to expose people's personal data in any way? Or, oh, is this product privacy compliant? No, that should have been done at the early stage of developing that product. A data protection impact assessment should have been carried out to say how would this product affect the rights and freedoms of data subjects with the way it will function, such that you can then build privacy and, maybe, for example, certain data will be masked. One very good example of this is our mobile banking apps. You will notice that sometimes you can do it in such a way that the account number is not visible to anyone that just opens the app. So even if a person's phone is stolen and they're able to access the app, you may not be able to see the account balance unless you make it visible by default, and you can also make it masked by default as well. So that just goes to tell you that people's privacy have been considered in building those products. So we'll now go into the meat of today's conversation. What legal risk management strategies can startups, and even legal and compliance professionals, what legal risk management strategies can you employ within your organization to help ensure that people's personal data is protected, is processed in the right way, and is secure? One way is through contracts. One thing I find in my practice is that some organizations are still using the very conventional standard contract templates, service agreements, and that's just all that they have. And they want to engage a third party vendor with whom they will be sharing personal data, but they believe, oh, once we've signed a service agreement, we've signed an agreement, we have a binding contract. But do you have a data sharing agreement? Do you have a data processing agreement? The need for these specific kinds of agreements is first, for Nigeria, it is legally required under the Nigeria Data Protection Act and the General Application and Implementation Directive. So where you would need to share data with a third party for them to process for you, a data processing agreement must be in place. This is what the regulation has said. So having your standard service agreement is no longer enough. DPAs, DSAs should be adopted now to help create extensive provisions around how are we going to enforce data subject rights when people come and say, oh, erase my data. I no longer want you to have my data, but you shared it with a third party. So how do you ensure that as you are erasing it from your end, the third party is erasing it from their end as well? You can have all of this in a data processing agreement as binding obligations on both parties. You would have um, extensive provisions on the purpose for processing personal data, such that data would now not be processed outside the purpose and scope of engagement. So because you shared your employees' email addresses with a payroll tech company, it doesn't mean that they should start sending marketing comms to your own employees. That will be outside the scope of the purpose for which you have engaged them. So just a data processing agreement or data sharing agreement just helps to make extensive provisions that cover every aspect of the data life cycle. How is it collected? How is it stored? For how long? How is it deleted? And so on. Also, breach notification obligations. So if an incident happens on the vendor's end, for example, they must notify you immediately, because you then have to notify the regulator immediately. So it's important to have very specific contracts, and just having a service agreement, maybe with one clause on data protection, is no longer enough. And even if it means maybe having a data processing addendum to what your main contract template looks like with extensive provisions, that also works as well. Or it can be a separate agreement entirely. And this isn't just important when for third parties, even for your employees, because employees in the course of their work might also have access to personal data of your customers. So how do you ensure that contractually they are also bound by data protection obligations? So there should be data protection clauses in their employment contracts and with contractors and sub-processors and so on. So whether you are engaging an employee, engaging a third party, or even your customers, having agreements with them, this one would really would a lot more tech companies would relate to this. So usually as people are creating or signing up on your platform, they are probably automatically also signing the service agreement. That's your standard service agreement. And you should also have a standard data processing agreement as well, which tells them how you will be processing their data. Another legal risk management strategy when it comes to data privacy and cybersecurity would be having the right data governance framework in place, and not just having one documentation that says data governance framework and then it says a lot, yet in practice, the company is not doing a lot in terms of proper data governance. What data governance really speaks to is what data do we have within our systems? Where does the data live? Where are we storing it? What databases are we using to store it? Are we storing it on, say, AWS? How are we storing the data? Or is it Google Drive? How are we storing the data? Where does it live? Who has access to it? And how do we provision access to it? How long do we keep it? And what third parties have we engaged to also help us process this data? Data governance is distinct from data protection, because data protection tilts more to how do we protect personal data of our data subjects, our customers, but data governance is really more focused on, as an organization, what governance processes do we have for all our data, even the ones that are not exactly personal data that we have within our systems. And a mature governance framework, or an organization that has reached a mature level of data governance, would usually have data inventories or a record of processing activities that says this is the data we're collecting, this is what we're using it for, this is where we're storing it, this is how long we're keeping it. A record of processing activities is just like an inventory of how you are processing the different kinds of data you're collecting. There'll be access management protocols within a company that has the right data governance framework in place, retention schedules that says for transaction data, we have a legal obligation for anti-money laundering um, monitoring to keep it for, say, 7 years within this country. So that's what having a data governance framework in place would entail. How are you governing the data that comes into your organization? Another risk management strategy is adopting privacy by design. This is a principle of data protection, but it's also a strategy you can adopt in that you have a process for product development, for example, that ensures that you have factored privacy considerations at the beginning phase of developing the product. A lot of organizations now, especially the ones that are tech driven, just want to ship solutions, and you want to innovate, you want to do something that's probably never been done before. But it's always important to also take a step back to say privacy is a very important aspect of our business. How do we build privacy into the product such that we gain our customers' trust, because they know that when they put in their financial details, there's nothing that is going to go wrong, because they trust that you have considered that you need to secure and protect their personal data as you were building this new product you've introduced into the market. And privacy by design should be integrated into your product development, your system architecture, procurement, software engineering, operational workflows, and every operational part of your business. How do you ensure that you have considered the customer's privacy from the beginning and is not just an afterthought? Practical measures to integrate privacy by design would be ensuring that, first of all, your product does not collect more data than it needs. If your product doesn't need to collect location data, why are you collecting it? If your product doesn't need to collect religious belief information, or data about whether someone is a Christian or a Muslim or a traditional, why are you collecting that? Even if you have like a form that you want to circulate publicly, if you don't need the data, then don't collect it. Privacy by design would also include like having encryption in place so that as data is moving from one point to another, it's encrypted, and it will be more difficult for people to access it, and then use it for purposes that you did not envisage as an organization, and so many other ways. Least privilege access. So only people who need to access certain information should have access to it. If they don't need to have access to it, then, and a practical way of doing this would be, as a startup, say you have a company Google Drive, different teams should only have access to the folders that concern their work. So there's really no reason why maybe finance should have access to a customer experience folder. They really don't need that access. Only people in the customer experience team should have access to the customer experience folder that might have maybe complaints, and then some customers may share additional information to help resolve these complaints. Someone in finance should typically not have access to it, and so on. Another good example is this app tracking transparency feature that Apple has on most Apple devices. So you are able to tell, and you are able to sort of regulate what apps within your device can access your location information. It really helps because you'd find that sometimes some products with, and some organizations might not even disclose this publicly, but the app can tell your location or has access to your background location. However, as a data subject, as a user, as a customer, you were not informed prior that that product was going to have that level of access to your device and how you use your device. So we must build privacy by design into how we are building products and how we're building solutions. Another risk management strategy will be vendor risk management. Because as I said earlier, sometimes you might do everything right as an organization, but when you then engage a third party who is not doing as much as they should, it can compromise everything that you have already put in place and all the work that you have already put in place. Because many businesses rely on cloud providers, software as a service platforms, payroll vendors, marketing tools to help process personal data for different purposes. It becomes imperative to have adequate assessments, vendor risk assessments, vendor privacy and security risk assessments, um, to ensure that you are also vetting these third parties that you're engaging. What's their security compliance like? What's their security level like? Hope you will not share personal data of your customers that you spent a lot of money to try to advertise to and convert to customers. Hope you, as you're sharing that data with them, they also have the right technical security infrastructure on their own side to protect that data. A good illustration of why vendor risk management is important is the data breach that affected Target in 2013 through compromised credentials belonging to a HVAC vendor. So the attackers accessed payment systems and stole millions of customer payment card details. It just shows how third-party vendor vulnerabilities can compromise your own corporate ecosystem. Another thing that founders, legal and compliance teams should also do is to document policies. This helps fulfill the accountability obligation as well, to show that you have policies in place, your employees are aware of these policies, your employees know what the data protection policy of your company is, they know what the information security policy of your company says, they know how to respond or how to report incidents when it happens, and things like that. Two critical policies in the context of our conversation today that you should have would be your incident response plan and your data breach management policy. The first one is, so when an incident happens, how do you respond? What do you do? What investigations do you do to trace where the vulnerability or where the incident stemmed from, like what was the root cause of the incident, and then how do you address it, what are the steps to take. And the data breach management policy also, so when a data breach occurs, how do we respond to it, how do we inform data subjects about it, how do we inform the regulator. So this is also a very important aspect. Poor response to incidents affect customer trust. It affects brand reputation more than the incident itself sometimes. For instance, in 2016, after a data breach that happened with Uber that they did not report on time, the company eventually faced severe criticism and also regulatory penalties and reputational backlash was something that they suffered for that. So when the regulator says report within 72 hours, ensure you comply with that. In a country like South Africa, for instance, what the law requires is you report within reasonable time. So just knowing what the reporting requirements for different countries are saying, because there is no way to retain customer trust if you are not transparent about these things and if you're not accountable, if you don't have the right documentation, to show that this is not an afterthought or something like a tick box. You should have documented policies and update them regularly as laws change, as new regulations come out, to also show that you are evolving as the law evolves and as technology evolves. And then training. Training is very important. As a founder, I mean, it's good that you know this, but it's also important to train your employees and your staff, because they would usually first come across personal data that you're collecting from customers. So if they don't understand how to protect it, if they don't understand what the policies of the company says, then you already have a vulnerability right there. 68% of breaches are caused by human error. Someone sends an email and then maybe they don't blind copy. It could be like a general email to some customers, but instead of putting all of them in BCC, the person just copies everybody. So I can see the next customer's email address and I can decide to start emailing them for different purposes, or even maybe gather all these emails and just sell it to someone who is willing to buy this data, because data is valuable. So if your employees are untrained, uninformed, they are prone to clicking suspicious links, or they use weak passwords and it's very easy to hack into their laptops, or they mishandle sensitive information and then either intentionally or unintentionally expose the company to privacy and security risks. You might have the right role-based access control, all the technological controls in place, but it cannot solve behavioral risks that that lead to or that cause human error. And I already mentioned risk assessments earlier. So having conducting a data protection impact assessment, a security risk assessment at the point of um, launching a new tool, engaging a new third party for a new product. It's important to have all of these assessments because you would also document your findings, and should there be an incident in future, you can always show the regulator that you did conduct an assessment and you really looked into some of the possible issues that could have come up, and these were the risks you identified, and these were your mitigation strategies. It helps your accountability obligation. And then for companies that are also now integrating AI into their operations, it's also important to have AI governance. And by AI governance, it's not, you don't think of it like, oh, you need, is one huge thing that you cannot achieve. AI governance means, oh, you have an AI use policy that informs employees that this is how you should use AI, and or maybe you have an approved list of AI tools to say within our company these are the AI tools we vetted and we're sure that they are privacy compliant and they're security compliant as well. So these are the tools we would use. Just having control and into having oversight over how AI is used within the company. Yes, such that employees are not using AI without authorization, employees are not using AI and just dumping people's personal data there without any kind of caution or control. Yes, it's very important to have some form of AI governance if your company, if your startup, your organization has already started to adopt AI in your daily operations. So those are the legal risk management strategies. But even while discussing these legal risk management strategies, I have alluded to some technical requirements here and there. So just to also look at some of them, having multi-factor authentication, having maybe even two-factor authentication, but just ensuring that the highest level of security possible is um will I say accorded to your systems now, for want of a better way to put it, but making sure that your systems really are operating on the highest level of security. Also regularly backing up the information that you store, having backups. This helps business continuity so that in the event of an incident and say a hacker gains access into the system, wipes everything out, you have a backup that you can simply just restore and operations can continue. So having online and offline backups. Also, auto updates. Regularly updating your systems, regularly updating your products. Say you have an app in the market, for instance. And this is something that a lot of companies already do, but not just for new features that you want to launch, but even to fix security and privacy vulnerabilities before a bad actor takes advantage of that. And now we're already rounding up the session, but we'll look at breach management timelines. So one thing I had said earlier is that a lot of organizations, the goal is for there to not be incidents by having the right measures in place, by putting all the right controls in place. However, how you respond when incidents do occur also really matters. So, in as much as you are having all the checks in place to prevent incidents from occurring, every smart business should also have a plan for how to respond when these incidents eventually occur. Because your response strategy would then either make or mar brand reputation and customer trust. If you don't respond adequately, then customers lose trust and they're like, so this happened and the company just swept it under the carpet. Oh, no wonder I got this phishing email. My email has been compromised and I didn't even know, and the company didn't even say anything to warn me. So it's very important that to retain customer trust, when incidents do eventually happen, you respond adequately. So one of the first things to do would be to detect and verify when an incident occurs. So an incident, and the word incident and breach are sometimes used interchangeably, but an incident could just be a suspected breach. But then when a breach is confirmed, yes, you then call it a breach. So identify the anomaly, what happened, and confirm that a breach actually occurred. Um, Also, contain the situation. So, disconnect any affected systems to stop any kind of unauthorized access or unauthorized disclosure of information. Someone is just extracting the data and leaking it on the dark web. Ensure to also immediately contain the incident or the breach. Then you would be required to analyze and notify the data subjects, notify the regulator. It's very important to do this because it also helps data subjects take the precaution that they can take on their own end so that the extent of the loss is not very far reaching. If data subjects are aware that, oh, our app was compromised, please ensure that you do not divulge your financial information to anyone who claims to be from this company. It also helps the data subject to take precaution. If you don't report and you don't say anything, the data subject will just assume that, oh, is this company now? And that will throw you up to so much liability. People will start suing the organization. So it's important to report to all stakeholders um, when incidents do happen. And then recover. Recover is the final phase. Restore your backup and do an audit. Do a privacy audit or a security audit to say where did the vulnerability come from? What loophole was a bad actor able to take advantage of? How do we close this gap? And yes, also documenting all of those things as well, because the regulator would also want to see that. So that's what the breach management timeline also is. And it's important because how you respond when breaches occur also really matters for customer trust. So, what are the core lessons we have learned from today's session? If you collect personal data, you are responsible for it. You're a data controller, as the law has described organizations that collect personal data and also determine the purpose for which that data will be processed. So it's important to take responsibility, and I don't even think we can overflog this. Also, security and privacy are business risks, not just an IT or a legal issue. Or it's not just IT's headache or legal's headache. Never downplay the role of human error in some of these risks. If you have an untrained staff, that's a weak point right there. If you engage a third party that does not have the right privacy and security controls in place, that's also a weak link there. So, human error is your biggest blind spot, and customer trust, of course, is your greatest asset. So, with having said that, we have come to the end of the session. I hope you have learned a thing or two. I hope you would find these strategies very helpful. Um, Maybe as you work within your team as a compliance officer or as a legal officer, or even as a curious founder who just wants to even understand what's this data privacy I keep hearing every day. I hope you now have a better understanding of what is required and how you can also implement some of these things in
Yes.
your organization. So yes, thank you very much. So back to you now, Joy.
Thank you so much, Barrister Loretta. That was truly an insightful session. I believe I speak for every single person on this call and those who eventually come across this video that we indeed gain value for our time. And we just have a few more points to round up. Now, in concluding, We have learned a lot of things today. However, some of the things that have stood out for us are the fact that the digital economy has transformed the way businesses operate, compete, and grow. Organizations today rely on data not simply as a support function, but as a central component of business strategy, customer engagement, operational efficiency, and innovation. From cloud computing and AI systems to remote work infrastructures and digital payment platforms, modern businesses are deeply interconnected through technology driven ecosystems that create enormous opportunities alongside equally significant risks. As these systems become more integrated into everyday operations, data privacy and cybersecurity are no longer issues that can be addressed occasionally or delegated entirely to technical departments operating behind the scenes. The reality facing organizations today is that cybersecurity incidents, privacy failures, and governance breakdowns carry consequences that extend far beyond technical disruption. A single breach can affect customer confidence, investor relationships, regulatory standing, operational continuity, contractual obligations, and public reputation simultaneously. In highly competitive digital markets, trust can take years to build and only moments to weaken. Businesses are therefore being pushed toward a broader understanding of cybersecurity and privacy as foundational components of corporate resilience rather than isolated compliance requirements. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time. And we honestly gained so much value during today's session. Now, to our viewers, we are glad that you tuned in and we look forward to having you again next month in another series of our monthly webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.